During my studies at medical school, the topic of immunology seemed very complicated. We were supposed to remember various types of so-called immune cells, receptors and pathways involving mediator molecules and of course antibodies. Then there was the clinical immunology with dozens of alleged specific diseases that were caused by underactive or overactive immune systems. This included the so-called autoimmune diseases, some of which were theorized to be caused by mysterious viruses that covertly slipped into the body. When it came to diagnostics, I witnessed many doctors trying to look clever by ticking lots of boxes on the immunology panels and then hoping that the generated laboratory report would tell them what was wrong with the patient. However, the whole concept of immunity has been built upon a very shaky foundation, which is good news, as most of it can be safely ignored in order to obtain perfect health. Experience never errs. It is only your judgments that err by promising themselves effects, such as are not caused by your experiments. Leonardo da Vinci. Immunity has a number of different meanings depending on the context. Aside from the meanings within law, a broad biological definition is the state of being immune from or insusceptible to a particular disease or the like. However, typically within the medical paradigm, it refers more narrowly to resistance to a claimed pathogen or infectious disease. The CDC states that immunity to a disease is achieved through the presence of antibodies to that disease in a person's system. This is stated under their vaccines and immunisation section, which is significant because the process of vaccination can certainly elicit positive antibody assay results, and the CDC and the vaccine sellers need this to be seen as a good thing. More on what that actually represents later, but for now we can already see a major flaw in the claim. In the 1980s, it was announced that there was a new syndrome called AIDS, and that the disease was caused by the, quote, human immunodeficiency virus. Never mind that other causes such as drug taking were identified. AIDS also absorbed existing conditions under its umbrella without any evidence of a virus. A multi-billion-dollar industry was born, as we documented in our book, Virus Mania. You can also watch my 3-part documentary of Dr. Valinda Turner and Andrew McIntyre's The Yin and Yang of HIV, first published in 1999 for more background on this scandal. The CDC claim that the presence of antibodies means that you are immune to a disease, but this has been flipped on its head with regard to so-called HIV antibodies, in which case they say the presence of the antibodies means you are overwhelmed with a potentially fatal infection, not protected from it. Isn't the antibody and immunity hypothesis thus falsified? Not when the establishment controls the science.
Because I represent science.
In 2009, Science Daily excused the situation by reporting that our body's natural HIV antibodies simply don't have a long enough reach to effectively neutralize the viruses they are meant to target. If you send AI to trawl the internet on this issue, the following, quote, answers are provided. Antibodies can't see the virus. HIV's surface is too complex. Antibodies are too weak. Antibodies arrive too late. HIV's ability to mutate. In summary, according to the AI result, these factors combined make it challenging for antibodies to effectively protect against HIV infection. Researchers are working to develop new strategies to improve the effectiveness of antibodies against HIV, such as designing more potent and targeted antibodies or developing vaccines that stimulate cellular immunity. If the scientists claiming such a position were honest, they would have to admit that the antibody hypothesis has failed. But
I'd say you failed.
Failed? Well, can't we just start over? I mean, I'm kind of having a personal problem. My mind was somewhere else.
in 2020, when the University of Queensland's supposed COVID-19 vaccine caused all 168 recipients to produce HIV antibodies, they were able to invoke this complete lack of scientific principles to explain themselves. You can watch my 2021 video, COVID-19 Shots, Cancer and HIV, for more on that story. Were the vaccine recipients diagnosed with HIV? No. Were they deemed immune to HIV since they were not infected with HIV but had antibodies? No. In the pseudoscientific world of antibody claims, it's a case of making all observations fit the model. The same can be seen on the Abbott Laboratories SARS-CoV-2 antibody fact sheet. Highlights include: you should not interpret the results of this test as an indication or degree of immunity or protection from infection. The absolute sensitivity of the SARS-CoV-2 IgG is unknown. A negative result should not be used to rule out infection. Due to the risk of false positive results, confirmation of positive results should be considered using a second, different antibody assay that detects the same type of antibodies. And the icing on the cake: regardless of the test result, individuals should continue to follow CDC guidelines. So what is the purpose of the test? Well, we could have told them that SARS-CoV-2 does not exist, but even on their own false premises, it's hard to say what they are thinking. Dismantling the world of antibodies is difficult because what has been written in textbooks and taught to doctors has not been shown to correspond to natural biology. For example, Wikipedia states that antibodies are large, Y-shaped proteins belonging to the immunoglobulin superfamily, which are used by the immune system to identify and neutralize antigens, such as bacteria and viruses, including those that cause disease. In reality, the claim that there is a specific antibody to a specific pathogen is a fantasy concept. When blood tests are performed, it is not a case of isolating the antibody protein and checking its structure and homogeneousness. The typical techniques are laboratory assays such as ELISA, the Western blot, and immunoelectrophoresis, all of which are based on the alleged specific antibody only binding to other molecules before being measured. The assays also have to be calibrated at a level of sensitivity set by the designer. Aside from the fact it can often not be verified if it was one specific antibody that triggered the assay, even if it was, how do they know what level the test should be set at? Once again, we can ask our AI system to summarize the theory of antibody titers, and we are treated to the following response. An antibody titer is a type of blood test that detects the presence and measures the amount of antibodies within the blood. It's an indicator of the strength of the body's immune response. The strength? Very interesting, Mr. AI bot. Let's read on. When titers are above a certain threshold, it demonstrates that the immune system has had prior exposure to either a vaccine or pathogen. This is one of the biggest get-out-of-jail-free cards. It is claimed that it is not the presence or absence of the antibody per se that is the determining factor, but the level of the antibody. And you have immunity if the level is high enough, because a high enough level makes you immune. Unless, of course, it's an antibody you don't want, like HIV, because then you are not immune to the disease, but have a really bad case of it. The so-called co-discoverer of HIV, Luc Montagnier, once said, antibodies are very specific. They know how to distinguish one molecule in 1 million. But as the Perth Group wrote in 2017, this cannot be correct. An antibody does not react exclusively with the antigen that induced its appearance. Antibodies induced by and directed against a given protein may react with other proteins, sometimes many proteins. Immunologists define these reactions as cross-reactions or cross-reactivities. In other words, far from distinguishing one molecule in 1 million, antibodies are promiscuous, a behaviour that, quote, shocked the immunological community and led to their use of this descriptor. The scientific literature is replete with data showing antibodies are not very specific. Indeed, out in the field, all results are apparently absorbed into the model, without the scientists admitting that the original hypothesis has been falsified. For example, in 1990, a team in Finland decided to test 144 blood samples obtained from dogs. Exactly half of the samples, quote, reacted with one or more HIV recombinant structural proteins. The paper was given the title Canine Sera that contain antibodies which recognise human immunodeficiency virus structural proteins. However, on their own terms, they should have stated these pooches have HIV, or at least these pooches have HIV antibodies. The original antibody hypothesis has thus now been framed as an unfalsifiable concept, and the CDC's statement that immunity to a disease is achieved through the presence of antibodies to that disease in a person's system is complete nonsense, because the antibodies are determined as being good or bad depending on the person's condition. Additionally, antibodies are declared as not providing immunity with all the so-called autoimmune diseases, such as rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, and lupus. In these and many other alleged specific conditions, the antibodies are said to be produced erroneously to attack the body. And you can watch my videos on alpha-gal syndrome and Lyme disease to see specific examples of more unscientific paradigms where the antibody result is interpreted any way they like in order to invent new tests and diseases. At this point, many people will ask, well, what are antibodies then? For those wanting to take a deeper dive, I recommend the resources at virology.com, where Mike Stone has written some excellent articles on the history of antibodies. As he explains, they were invented as a theoretical construct, and a huge amount of speculation then followed. They were not shown to be pure and specific molecules with the claimed properties of an immune action in living organisms. For example, the experimental evidence could be based on crude in vitro models, where blood samples are mixed with other proteins or antigens, and if precipitation or clumping developed, then it was declared that this binding somehow mirrored a protective action inside the body. In Mike's article, Antibodies Are Not Required for Immunity, there are quotes taken from a 2020 Live Science webpage titled, "Why do we develop lifelong immunity to some diseases but not others?" It stated that scientists still aren't sure why we maintain our antibody responses longer for some diseases compared with others. It's possible that some of these more common diseases, such as chickenpox and mono, actually are reinfecting us more frequently than we realise, but that the antibodies we do have crush the infection before we notice. And in those cases, the immune system would be at full capacity again and again because of the reinfections. This exemplifies the complete nonsense of mainstream immune theory, where there are no fixed principles. They just adapt the story to fit as they go. Antibodies are clearly not what the textbooks say. We must always keep in mind that the purported detection of them is through biochemical reactions in assays. That is, an observation in a laboratory process. This is not a claim that the tests are meaningless or that no proteins were present in the sample. However, at most we can say that a class of protein may be in a higher amount than is typically found. These proteins are part of an inflammatory or healing response to an insult, and their presence may or may not cause any symptoms in an individual. Vaccine makers like to see antibodies appear in the recipients and have used adjuvants such as mercury and aluminium in their injectables to enhance this effect. As a 2010 paper in the journal Immunity stated, adjuvants have been traditionally used to increase the magnitude of an adaptive response to a vaccine, based on antibody titer or ability to prevent infection. Well, the second part cannot be correct, so all they can say is that adding more toxins to the vaccine causes more tissue damage and inflammation. Some of us that have researched these areas have concluded that immunology is a derivative of germ theory, and they are used in parallel to bolster one another. However, the central axioms in both have been falsified, which is why we see a never-ending list of new hypotheses being piled up on top of the original ones to make any and all observations fit the model. The word immunology dates from 1906 and the immune system from 1917. These were introduced after the word immune, which took its specific modern medical notion of exempt from a disease, typically because of inoculation, was first used in 1881 in a back formation from immunity. In other words, this whole concept came about in conjunction with the promotion of germ theory in the developing vaccine industry. This video has largely focused on antibodies because it is one of the areas of the concept where they are at least attempting to objectively measure something. other aspects of immunity slip into even more unfalsifiable paradigms. If you saw last week's video on gastritis, you will remember that Dr. Barry Marshall was spontaneously recovering after swallowing Helicobacter pylori before any antibiotics were started. To explain this, the authors of the paper stated, "In our subject, the host defences eradicated the organism, but in individuals who are unable to clear a pyloric Campylobacter infection, chronic gastritis may develop. This enters into a tautological paradigm. You don't get a disease because you are immune, or you do get it because you are not immune. There is no independent variable here. The word immune has simply been substituted into the meaningless equation." On this note, you may witness an argument being put forward that having a condition only once in your life proves the concept of an immune system and even viruses. With that model, could one claim that puberty is triggered by a virus? In all seriousness though, indirect measures can only be scientifically validated if the virus was shown to exist in the first place, something that has never been done. In my older videos, I sometimes use the term immune system, but over time we have moved away from the concept. Now we can see that the body has repair and detoxification mechanisms that have nothing to do with any fight against germs. The body can enter inflammatory states, and this can become chronic if the underlying causes are not corrected. There is no evidence that microorganisms are the precipitants of these states, but their numbers and activities may change in response to the underlying changes in the tissue. Even in the natural health community, there is still a lot of adherence to germ theory with the concept of immune-boosting supplements and remedies. In my own experience, I found a better way to true health by no longer considering it a battle, but instead focusing on harmonizing with nature and honoring God's laws. There are plenty of resources at drsambailey.com aimed at supporting the ways you can do this too. If you enjoyed this video, please visit supportdrsam.com